The air in the grand parlor of the Vance mansion was a suffocating blanket, thick with the cloying sweetness of Savannah's jasmine and the sharp, wet smell of lime and damp plaster. Eleanor Vance, mistress of the house, swept into the room, the rustle of her silk dress a sound of pure irritation. She expected to find her slave Dinah nearing the end of the arduous task of whitewashing the walls. Instead, the room was empty, the heavy bucket of whitewash sitting on the floor barely touched. And there, on the main wall where the afternoon sun should have been casting a golden glow, was a dark, life-sized silhouette of a woman. Her form, her posture, the very tilt of her head was captured perfectly in a paint that was not whitewash. It was the exact shape of Dinah. The woman herself was gone. Eleanor's cry of rage and confusion echoed through the silent house, a shrill, piercing sound that shattered the heavy stillness, but the shadow on the wall gave no answer. It just was. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The story of the shadow began in the days leading up to that sweltering afternoon in 1844. Dinah Miles moved through the Vance household with a practiced stillness, a quiet, observant woman whose presence was as soft as a moth's wing. Her hands were skilled, capable of mending the most delicate lace or scrubbing the heaviest pot with equal dexterity. But her eyes held a deep, ancient sorrow, a quiet grief that seemed to carry the weight of generations. Yet within that sorrow there was an unyielding spark, a flicker of a spirit that refused to be entirely extinguished. Dinah found her solace not in the grand rooms of the mansion, but in the small, hidden beauties of the world outside its walls. She cherished the intricate patterns of moss that clung to the mighty oak trees, the way the Spanish moss swayed like gray, weeping veils in the humid breeze. She listened to the songs of the crickets at dusk, a chorus that spoke of a world far removed from the cruelty of her own. She was a keeper of stories, tales passed down from her grandmother, whispers of African spirits, of the power of leaving a mark, of souls that could not be chained. Her foil in every way was Eleanor Vance, a woman whose cruelty was born not of simple malice, but of a deep-seated vanity and a gnawing insecurity. Her life was a meticulously crafted performance for the benefit of Savannah society. Her home, her clothes, her parties, even her husband were all props in a play of her own devising. She demanded perfection from everyone and everything, a flawless reflection of her own imagined grandeur. Her slaves, most of all, were expected to be silent, efficient, and invisible, extensions of her will. Any flaw, any mistake was not just an inconvenience, it was a personal affront, a crack in the fragile facade of her perfect world. The only person who seemed to see the spark in Dinah's eyes was old Jacob, the elderly stable hand. He was a father figure to her, a man whose own spirit had weathered decades of bondage without breaking. His hands were gnarled and twisted from a lifetime of hard labor, but his mind was sharp, a repository of the community's oral history and its spiritual traditions. He saw the stories in Dinah's gaze and nurtured them. One afternoon, while he was mending a harness in the cool, earthy-smelling stable, he looked at her as she stood in the doorway, a silhouette against the bright sunlight. "They can own your hands, child," he said, his voice a low, hushed tone that was barely more than a whisper. "But they can't own your soul unless you give it to them. Remember the stories. A person ain't just flesh and bone. We're story and spirit, too." His words settled deep within her, a seed of an idea she did not yet understand. The turning point came during a tense dinner party at the Vance home. The parlor was filled with the glittering elite of Savannah, the air buzzing with gossip and laughter. The candlelight danced off polished silver and crystal glasses, and the scent of roasted duck and spiced wine filled the room. Dinah moved through the space with her usual quiet grace, refilling glasses, clearing plates, a ghost in the background of the opulent scene. As she reached for an empty platter on a side table, a guest shifted his chair abruptly, bumping into her. She stumbled, her hand brushing against a delicate, expensive porcelain bird, a prized possession of Eleanor's. It teetered for a moment on the edge of the table before falling to the polished floor with a sickening crack, shattering into a dozen pieces. A hush fell over the room. Dinah froze, her heart pounding in her chest. Eleanor, seated at the head of the table, didn't so much as flinch. Her smile tightened almost imperceptibly, a subtle, chilling shift in her perfectly composed expression. "It is of no consequence," she said to her guests, her voice as smooth as honey, dismissing the incident with a wave of her hand. But Dinah saw the cold fire in her eyes and knew that payment would be exacted. After the last guest had departed, leaving the scent of their perfume and cigars lingering in the air, Eleanor confronted Dinah in the now silent parlor. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her words were a low, venomous hiss, each one a carefully aimed dart. "You are a clumsy, worthless creature," she whispered, her face a mask of cold fury. "You exist to serve, and you cannot even do that without destroying what is beautiful." She pointed a long, slender finger toward the walls. "You will spend the next 2 days undoing your mistake. The parlor needs a fresh coat of whitewash. I want it so bright it hurts the eyes. You will do it alone." The punishment was not just about the labor, it was about humiliation. The parlor was Eleanor's stage, her pride and joy. Forcing Dinah to work there to erase any sign of imperfection was a display of absolute power, a reminder of her place. Dinah lowered her head and accepted the punishment with outward subservience, her voice a quiet, "Yes, mistress." But inside, as she stood there amidst the wreckage of the porcelain bird and the lingering ghosts of the party, a decision began to form, solid and unyielding as stone. The next morning, Dinah prepared the whitewash under old Jacob's worried gaze. He watched her from the doorway of the shed, his brow furrowed with concern. The process was a ritual of harsh sensations. She hauled the heavy sack of quicklime, the fine powder coating her arms and face. The acrid chemical smell of the slaking lime filled the air as she added water, the mixture hissing and steaming like a living thing. She stirred the thick, gritty paste with a heavy wooden paddle, the stark, blinding whiteness of it a stark contrast against her dark skin. The work was heavy, and the sun was already beginning to beat down with oppressive heat. But as she stirred, her mind was not on the grueling labor that lay ahead. She was not thinking of the burning sun or the ache that would soon settle into her back and shoulders. She was thinking of her grandmother's tales whispered in the dark of the slave quarters years ago. Stories of shadow walkers, spirits who could impress their essence onto the physical world, leaving a part of themselves behind. She thought about how she had nothing to leave behind. She had no name of her own, only the one given to her by the Vances. She had no children, no legacy, nothing to say that she had ever existed. The whitewash, a substance meant to erase, to purify, to cover over all stains and imperfections, began to look like something else to her. It was not an instrument of her punishment, but a canvas for her defiance. In that moment, stirring the thick white paste under the hot Georgia sun, Dinah Miles made a choice. She would not be erased. The parlor was waiting. Dinah stepped inside, leaving the bucket of whitewash by the door. She was alone. The house was still, caught in the sleepy heat of the late morning. Sunlight, thick and golden, streamed through the tall, mullioned windows, cutting across the dusty air and casting her shadow long and sharp against the bare wall she was meant to cover. It was a perfect dark replica of her, a silent companion that had followed her for her entire life. Today it would not follow. It would stay. This was not just painting, she knew. This was a ritual of transference, an act of defiance her grandmother had only ever spoken of in fearful whispers. This was a story made real, From a small hidden pocket sewn into the inside of her dress, Dinah pulled a small cloth-wrapped bundle. It was her only true possession in the world. She unwrapped it carefully, her fingers trembling slightly. Inside lay the meager components of her rebellion. There was a pinch of dark ash saved from a fire pit where old Jacob had told stories of their ancestors, his voice a low rumble in the night. There were dried herbs, fragrant and brittle, given to her by Jacob for protection, a charm against the evil eye and the lash. And there, glinting with a malevolent sharpness, was a single, curved piece of the broken porcelain bird. The instrument of her punishment would now be the key to her liberation. She took the shard, its edge like a razor, and pressed it firmly against the tip of her index finger. A single perfect drop of dark red blood welled up. She held her finger over a small hollowed-out gourd she had brought, squeezing the blood into a small portion of the thick whitewash she had scooped into it. She added the ash and crumbled the dried herbs, mixing it all together with her finger. The pristine white paste swirled, darkened and transformed, turning a deep, shadowy gray, the color of a storm cloud, the color of twilight, the color of a soul's imprint. She did not reach for a brush. A brush was a tool of the house, a thing that belonged to the Vances. This act had to be her own. Using her hands, her own skin and bone, she knelt before the wall. The sun was perfectly positioned, her shadow a clear and undeniable presence. She dipped her fingers into the gray mixture and began to trace the outline. It was a slow, deliberate, and deeply personal act. The gritty plaster was cool and rough beneath her touch. With every stroke, she felt a draining, a giving, a pouring out of her very essence. She was not painting a picture, she was decanting her spirit. She painted her memories into the wall, the feel of her mother's hand, the taste of a stolen wild strawberry, the sound of her grandmother's songs. She painted her pain into it, the sting of the overseer's whip, the ache of hunger, the constant grinding humiliation of her existence. She painted her sorrow, the quiet grief for a life she would never live, for the children she would never have. The sun moved slowly across the sky, its light shifting and her shadow moved with it. She adjusted her position, tracing and retracing, filling in the shape not with a single static image but with a composite of her presence throughout the day. A living shadow that held the memory of time itself. As she worked, the world outside the parlor seemed to fade away. The sounds of the house, the distant shouts from the street, the chirping of birds, all of it dissolved into a low hum. There was only the wall, her hands, and the slow, steady emptying of herself into the plaster. When she was finished, she was light, hollowed out, a mere shell. She looked at the wall, at the perfect dark silhouette that now lived there, and she felt a sense of peace. She had left her mark. Eleanor Vance returned to the parlor in the late afternoon, fanning herself with a palmetto fan, expecting to find Dinah exhausted and the walls gleaming with a painful uniform whiteness. The sight that greeted her was so utterly incomprehensible that for a moment her mind refused to process it. The air was still and heavy. The bucket of whitewash was still by the door. And on the wall, where there should have been a fresh coat of paint, was the silhouette. It was stark, impossibly dark, and unnervingly detailed. This was no crude drawing. It seemed to have depth, as if one could take a step and fall right into it. It captured the slight, weary tilt of Dinah's head, the posture of a woman burdened but utterly infuriatingly unbroken. It was her slave, captured in shadow, yet more present, more solid than she had ever been in life. Eleanor's initial shriek of "Dinah" was a blade of sound that faded into a confused, sputtering muttering. She took a step closer, her hand fluttering to her throat. The silhouette did not waver. It seemed to absorb the light in the room, a void in the shape of a woman. She backed away, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She turned and fled, her silk dress whispering against the floorboards as she ran to find her husband. "Robert!" she screamed, her voice cracking with a mixture of rage and a new, unfamiliar terror. "Robert, come at once. See what the creature has done. What is this devilry? She has ruined the wall. Find her! Find her now." Robert Vance was a pragmatic and brutish man, a man who believed the world operated on simple principles of ownership, profit, and force. When he saw the silhouette, he did not see devilry. He saw vandalism, a final insolent act from a runaway slave. He immediately organized a search party. The overseer, a grim, sunburnt man with cold eyes, gathered his dogs, their excited yelps and barks echoing across the manicured lawns. They searched the grounds, the stables, the sprawling gardens, and then moved into the dense, humid woods that bordered the property. The dogs cast about, sniffing the ground, whining in confusion. There was no trail, no scent, no broken twigs or footprints in the soft earth. It was as if Dinah Miles had simply dissolved into the humid afternoon air. Back in the parlor, the atmosphere was curdling. Eleanor, her face pale and drawn, ordered a young servant girl named Sarah to scrub the mark from the wall. Sarah, her eyes wide with a fear that was already taking root among the house slaves, approached the wall with a bucket of hot, soapy water and a stiff brush. The whispers had already begun, stories of Dinah's quiet power, of her connection to the old ways. Sarah could feel the eyes of the other servants on her as she dipped the brush in the water and hesitantly reached toward the silhouette. The moment the wet bristles touched the dark shape, a sound like water hitting a hot skillet, a sharp, angry sizzle filled the silent room. The brush was violently knocked from her hand, clattering to the floor as if slapped by an invisible force. Sarah cried out and scrambled backward, her heart hammering against her ribs. The silhouette remained utterly untouched, as dark and as dry as it had been moments before. Robert, returning from the fruitless search, was enraged by this new development. He saw it as a trick, some concoction of paint and oil that resisted water. "Useless," he snarled, shoving Sarah out of the way. He was a man who solved problems with his own two hands. He stormed out of the room and returned with a heavy metal scraper, the kind used to remove old paint and stubborn grime. "I'll have this off in a minute," he growled, planting his feet firmly in front of the wall. He set the edge of the scraper against the plaster and pushed, putting his considerable weight behind it. A horrific screeching sound filled the parlor as metal ground against the wall. Sparks flew, but the scraper slid across the surface of the silhouette as if it were a sheet of ice. It could not mar the image. It could not even scratch it. He tried again, his face turning red with effort, the muscles in his arms bulging. The metal screeched, the sound setting everyone's teeth on edge, but the dark paint, or whatever it was, remained pristine. It was as if the color was not on the wall, but in it, an integral part of the plaster itself, as deep as the house's foundations. He finally threw the scraper down in disgust, his chest heaving. He was being defied, not by a person he could whip or sell, but by a wall. In the days that followed, the atmosphere in the Vance mansion shifted from anger to a creeping, unnatural dread. The parlor was locked, the key turned by Eleanor herself. It was a cursed space, a room that held an impossible stain. But while the Vances saw a curse, the enslaved community saw something else entirely. The whispers that had started in the kitchen and the laundry rooms turned into a powerful, cohesive narrative. The story was told in hushed tones in the quarters at night, passed from one person to another like a sacred text. Old Jacob became the keeper and interpreter of the miracle. One evening, sitting with a small group under the heavy branches of a live oak, he gave voice to what they all felt. "She didn't run," he said, his voice a low rhythmic hum that was both a story and a sermon. "She walked through. She left her mark so we'd know, so they'd know. They can own your hands, they can own your back, but they can't own your story, they can't own that. He pointed a gnarled finger toward the distant, dark shape of the mansion. They can't ever wash that away. In that moment, the silhouette was transformed. For the Vances, it was a permanent scar of defiance, a blemish on their perfect world, a source of shame and fear. But for the enslaved, it was a monument. It was not an act of vandalism, but an act of creation. It was not a stain, but a symbol of spiritual power, a testament to a soul that refused to be erased. It was a quiet, powerful victory, and it was only the beginning. Months bled into one another, each day marked by the locked parlor door and the festering obsession within Eleanor Vance. The initial shock had hardened into a grim, unyielding resolve. The shadow was a personal war, and she would be its victor. Her first campaign was one of brute financial force. She sent word to Charleston, a city that prided itself on its refinement, and hired 2 professional painters, men with reputations for transforming the homes of the wealthy into palaces of light and color. They arrived with their own ladders and cloths, exuding an air of detached professionalism. They tutted at the state of the wall, whispering to each other about humidity and inferior local materials. Eleanor, with a grim satisfaction, presented them with the finest oil-based paint money could buy, a creamy, thick substance that smelled of linseed and turpentine and promised absolute, permanent coverage. For 2 days, the men worked, applying coat after coat, their brushes moving with practiced efficiency. When they were finished, the wall was a flawless, gleaming expanse of white. The shadow was gone, buried beneath a layer of expensive pigment. Eleanor breathed a sigh of relief for the first time in months. She paid the men handsomely, and for a week the parlor remained a testament to her victory. But then, a small blister appeared, a tiny bubble in the smooth surface, directly over the place where the silhouette's heart would be. The next day, there were more. A network of fine cracks spread across the paint, and then, with a soft flaking sound, the new layers began to peel. It did not peel randomly. It flaked away with an unnerving precision, curling back only from the area of the silhouette, revealing the dark, defiant shape perfectly intact beneath. The expensive Charleston paint lay in a ring of pale, brittle curls on the floor, like a shed skin. The shadow remained. Robert Vance, having witnessed his wife's renewed hysteria, decided a more aggressive approach was needed. If paint could not cover it and metal could not scrape it, then the wall itself had to be the problem. He rode into Savannah and returned with a mason, a stout, pragmatic man with dust in his eyebrows and calluses on his hands. Robert's instructions were simple. The entire section of the wall was to be demolished and rebuilt. The mason, though he had heard the whispers that now permeated the city, agreed for a price. The work was loud and violent. The sound of the hammer and chisel echoed through the house as the mason chipped away the plaster, revealing the lath and horsehair insulation beneath. He tore it all out, leaving a gaping hole in the wall, exposing the dark red brick of the chimney breast behind it. The shadow and the plaster that held it was reduced to a pile of dust and rubble on the floor, which was swept up and carted away. For 3 days, the house felt lighter. The mason worked diligently, rebuilding the wall with fresh lath and applying new coats of plaster. The wall was a pristine, uniform white, still damp and smelling of earth and lime. The curse had been physically excised from the house. On the 4th morning, Eleanor entered the room with a triumphant smile, only to feel the air grow cold. A faint gray outline, like a ghost of a memory, was visible on the new plaster. She watched, frozen in horror, as throughout the day it slowly darkened, coalesced, and sharpened. By noon, the silhouette of Dinah had fully re-emerged, as if bleeding through from some other dimension. The mason, who had come to collect his final payment, saw it, and his face went pale. He gathered his tools in a hurried silence. "I can't explain it, sir," he said to Robert Vance, his voice low and shaky, avoiding eye contact. It's like the wall itself is remembering her. I've done my job. The wall is sound. He shouldered his bag and backed away toward the door. I'm not coming back. The story of the Vance shadow, once a piece of hushed servant gossip, had escaped the confines of the mansion and become a choice piece of Savannah folklore. It was a Gothic tale told over tea and cards, embellished with each telling. Eleanor's social standing, once her most prized and fiercely protected possession, began to crumble under the weight of the legend. She attended a lavish garden party at a neighboring mansion, determined to hold her head high, to pretend that nothing was amiss. But the world she had once commanded now viewed her as a curiosity, a figure in a ghost story. Women who had once vied for her attention now gathered in small clusters, whispering behind their delicate fans, their eyes darting toward her with a mixture of pity and morbid fascination. The air, which should have been filled with polite conversation and laughter, seemed to crackle with the unspoken name, Dinah. The story made her look foolish, her husband impotent and their house accursed. No one wanted to be associated with such a strange and unsettling phenomenon. Invitations to dinners and balls, which had once filled her mailbox, dwindled to a trickle and then stopped altogether. She was being ostracized, not with open hostility, but with the far more cruel weapon of polite avoidance. The shadow, which she had seen as Dinah's final private insult, had become her public shame, a stain not on her wall, but on her name. Her obsession, fed by this social isolation, deepened into a kind of madness. The locked parlor became her private world. She began talking to the silhouette, her one constant companion. Some days she would stand before it for hours, pleading with it, her voice a desperate whisper. What do you want? Why won't you leave me be? Other days her grief would curdle into a familiar rage, and she would scream at the silent shape, her voice hoarse and raw, her words echoing in the empty, dusty room. You will not defeat me. This is my house, my house. The silhouette offered no reply, its silent, watchful presence a dark mirror reflecting her own unraveling mind. While the parlor was a place of torment for Eleanor, it was slowly becoming something else for the people who still lived and worked in the shadows of the Vance household. Late one night, long after the masters had retired to their troubled sleep, Sarah, the young servant girl who had first tried to scrub the shadow away, crept down the darkened hallway. The floorboards creaked softly under her bare feet. She held a single flickering candle, its small flame pushing back the oppressive darkness. She was not alone. Behind her, moving with a practiced silence, were two other house slaves, an older woman who worked in the laundry and a young man who helped in the kitchens. They reached the locked parlor door. Sarah produced a small rusted key, one she had stolen from a ring in Robert Vance's study. With a soft click, the lock turned. They slipped inside, closing the door behind them. The room was cold and still, the air thick with the scent of dust and something else, an electric, watchful quality. The moonlight, filtered through the tall windows, cast a silvery glow on the floor, illuminating the dark silhouette on the wall. It seemed even darker at night, a true void. They didn't speak. There was no need for words. This was a pilgrimage. The older woman went first. She approached the wall and lightly, reverently touched the outstretched hand of the silhouette. Her fingers lingered for a moment, a silent communion. Then she stepped back, her face calm. The young man went next, then Sarah. They were not touching plaster, they were touching a symbol, a presence. It was a moment of silent connection to the woman who had defied their world. Before they left, Sarah knelt and placed a small, smooth, gray stone at the base of the wall, directly beneath the shadow's feet. It was a simple offering, a token of remembrance, a piece of the earth for a soul that now inhabited the house. The room was no longer a place of punishment or a prison of obsession. For them, in these stolen secret moments, it had become a sanctuary. Dinah's act had created a powerful hidden church of remembrance within the very walls of the house that had enslaved her, a place of power that her captors could never understand. Robert Vance sat in his study, a heavy crystal glass of whiskey in his hand, the amber liquid catching the lamplight. The door to the room was closed, but he could feel the presence of the locked parlor down the hall, a silent, mocking weight on his entire house. He was a man who believed in tangible things, in profit and loss, in cause and effect, in force. He believed that any problem could be solved with enough money or enough violence. But this shadow, it defied all his principles. His business was beginning to suffer. Rumors of the cursed house had spread to the docks and the counting houses. Men he had done business with for years were suddenly hesitant to extend credit, their handshakes less firm, their eyes evasive. The Vance name, once a symbol of solid, ruthless prosperity, was now associated with madness and bad luck. He looked at his account books, the neat columns of figures that had once brought him such satisfaction, but they now seemed like a meaningless fiction. His profits were dwindling, and his wife, the woman who was supposed to be the ornament of his success, was losing her mind. Her days spent locked in a room, screaming at a wall. He took a long drink of the whiskey, the burn in his throat a welcome distraction. He was being defeated, not by a business rival, not by a bad harvest, but by a ghost story, by a patch of paint on a wall. He could not whip it, he could not buy it, he could not sell it, he could not reason with it, and he could not destroy it. The shadow was not just on his wall, it was on his legacy, an indelible dark mark of his own impotence and failure. He stared at the locked parlor door, the wood seeming to ripple in his whiskey-soaked vision. And for the first time in his life, Robert Vance felt a profound and terrifying sense of dread. He was trapped in a house with a memory that was stronger than he was. The seasons turned, grinding the years between them like millstones. The vibrant green of Savannah summers faded into the muted golds of autumn, and the brief damp chill of winter gave way to the riotous bloom of spring, again and again. The world outside the Vance mansion convulsed. The whispers of secession grew into the roar of cannons, and the Civil War tore through the heart of the South, a fever that broke the back of the old world. The Vance fortune, built on the backs of people like Dinah, evaporated like mist in the morning sun. The cotton fields lay fallow, the shipping business withered, and the name Vance lost its currency. Robert, a man whose identity was forged in ownership and control, could not survive in a world where he owned and controlled nothing. He died not from a bullet, but from a common fever, his body giving up long after his spirit had been broken. Through it all, the shadow in the parlor remained. It watched as the fine silk curtains rotted on their rings, as dust motes danced like frantic ghosts in the slivers of light, as the polish on the floorboards dulled and splintered. The war did not touch it. The passage of time did not fade it. It was a point of absolute stillness in a world of violent change. The post-war era found Eleanor a bitter, impoverished recluse in a decaying house that was now her prison. The grand rooms echoed with the ghosts of parties she could no longer host, and the overgrown gardens were a testament to a life that had withered on the vine. The silhouette in the parlor became her only constant companion, a dark, silent mirror reflecting her own faded glory and the permanence of her defeat. The room was thick with the smell of dust and damp, but the shadow remained as sharp and clear as the day it was made, an unblinking eye in the heart of the ruin. It was into this world of ghosts and decay that Alistair Finch arrived in the 1870s. A journalist from a Boston newspaper, Alistair was a man of his time, driven by a relentless curiosity and a belief in the power of the printed word. He was tall and lean, with thoughtful eyes that missed little. He had come south to collect stories, not the official histories written by the victors, but the folklore, the whispers, the legends that spoke to the true experience of the people, especially the newly freed. He was documenting a world in transition, and he heard the tale of the shadow woman of Savannah in a crowded market, a story told in a hushed, reverent tone by an old woman selling sweetgrass baskets. Intrigued by the blend of the supernatural and the historical, he felt the familiar pull of a story that needed to be told. His inquiries led him to the skeletal remains of the Vance mansion. Weeds choked the once manicured lawns, and the white paint of the columns was peeling away to show the gray, weathered wood beneath. It looked like a beached whale, a massive, forgotten thing left to rot by the tide of history. After several attempts, he managed to get an audience with the aged Eleanor. He found her in what had once been a music room, sitting on a faded settee surrounded by shrouded furniture. She was a ghost in her own home, a wraith dressed in tattered, out-of-style finery. Her hair was thin and white, but her eyes, when she looked at him, still held a spark of the old cold fire. Alistair approached her with a practiced gentleness, his hat in his hands. "Mrs. Vance," he began, his voice soft, "I hope I'm not disturbing you. I'm a writer, a historian of sorts. I've heard a remarkable story about this house, about a woman named Dinah." The name was a spark in a powder keg. Eleanor's frail body went rigid and her head snapped up. Her voice, when she spoke, was a dry, cracking sound, like old paper tearing, yet it was filled with a lifetime of condensed fury. "Lies," she hissed, her bony fingers clutching the fabric of her dress. "All of it. Filthy lies told by ignorant people." She struggled to her feet, her body trembling with a sudden, shocking strength. "There was no Dinah. There was a slave, a runaway. She vandalized my home before she fled. What you see on that wall, if you have been trespassing in my parlor, is a stain, a chemical anomaly in the plaster, a trick of the light." Her eyes burned with a desperate, delusional intensity. She was trying to rewrite history with the sheer force of her will. "Now get out of my house!" she shrieked, her voice rising to a pathetic, reedy pitch. "Get out before I have you thrown out!" Alistair, seeing that there was no story to be had from this woman but one of madness and denial, bowed his head slightly and retreated, leaving her alone with her ghosts and her rage. Undeterred, Alistair knew that the truth of the story did not lie with the master but with the enslaved. He followed the trail of the whispers, asking questions in the freedmen's communities that had sprung up on the outskirts of the city. He was directed to a small settlement of cabins nestled among tall pines, a place that felt a world away from the decaying grandeur of Savannah's squares. It was there, sitting on the porch of a small, neatly kept cabin, that he found him. Old Jacob. He was ancient, a man who seemed to be made of gnarled wood and woven history. His skin was a road map of a long and difficult life, and his eyes were cloudy with age, but they were not empty. They held a deep, quiet wisdom. He was weaving a sweetgrass basket, his gnarled fingers moving with a slow, steady rhythm that seemed as natural as breathing. Alistair approached slowly, respectfully. When he mentioned Dinah's name, Jacob's hands stilled. He looked up, and the clouds in his eyes seemed to part for a moment, revealing a light of sharp, clear memory. He gestured with his head to a simple wooden stool on the porch. "Sit," Jacob said, his voice a low, rhythmic hum, like the sound of the wind in the pines. Alistair sat, placing his notebook on his knee. "They told me you knew her," Alistair said. "They said you knew the truth of what happened." Jacob looked out toward the trees, his gaze fixed on something far away, something deep in the past. "The truth ain't always what happened," he began, his voice gaining a quiet strength. "It's what the story means. The Vances, they tell a story about a runaway slave who ruined a wall. That's their truth. It's a small, mean story, and it's a lie. He turned his gaze to Alistair, his eyes holding the journalist's with a surprising intensity. Dinah wasn't a runaway. She was a conqueror, you understand? The mistress, Eleanor, she wanted to wipe her away. That broken bird was just an excuse. She wanted to make Dinah feel like nothing, a clumsy thing that breaks what is beautiful. She wanted to punish her by making her cover the world in white, to erase every mark, every stain, until the room was as blank and empty as she wanted Dinah's soul to be. He paused, his fingers tracing the edge of the unfinished basket. But Dinah, she remembered the old stories. Stories from the before time, about how a person ain't just what you can see and touch. A person is a story, a spirit. The mistress wanted to make her into nothing, so Dinah decided to make herself into something that could never be wiped away. She didn't run from that house. She took it over. She painted her soul into that house. She poured all her pain, all her memories, all her sorrow, and all her strength into that wall. She left her body behind. That was the part they owned, the part they could hurt. She left it behind like an old coat she didn't need no more, and she walked into the story where she would be free forever. Alistair was captivated, his pen forgotten on his lap. He was listening to a poet, a prophet. Jacob continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. They tried to get rid of her. Oh, they tried. They scrubbed it, and the water sizzled off like it was touching fire. They scraped it, and the metal screamed but couldn't leave a mark. They painted over it, and the shadow shrugged it off like a snake sheds its skin. They tore the whole wall down, broke it into dust, and built a new one. He chuckled, a dry, rustling sound. And she came right back, because she ain't in the plaster, she ain't in the paint, she's in the space, she's in the story of that house now. She won. She's still winning. Alistair finally found his voice, his own question sounding small and academic in the face of such a powerful narrative. So you believe she's still there? As a ghost? Jacob shook his head slowly. A ghost is something that's lost, something that's stuck. Dinah ain't lost. She's anchored. She made herself a monument because no one was going to make one for her. She's not there to haunt them. She's there to remind them, to remind us, that you can't erase a soul. Alistair left Jacob's cabin as the sun was setting, the sky streaked with orange and purple. He felt as though he had been given a sacred text, a key to understanding not just one woman's story, but the story of a people. He returned to his boarding house in Boston and wrote. He wrote not just as a journalist, but as a witness. He contrasted the two worlds he had seen, the bitter, decaying, and ultimately powerless world of Eleanor Vance, a prisoner in her own crumbling mansion, haunted by a past she could not erase, and the powerful, spiritual, and enduring world of Jacob's narrative, a story of resistance, transformation, and liberation. He titled the article, "The Shadow of Savannah, a Legend of Resistance." It was published in his Boston newspaper, and through the magic of the telegraph and the syndication wire, it spread. It was picked up by papers in New York, in Philadelphia, in Chicago. The story of Dinah Miles was no longer a local rumor, a piece of Savannah gossip. It was a national legend. The house, once a private prison and a symbol of the Vance family's shame, was transformed in the public imagination into a landmark, a place of pilgrimage for the curious and the reverent. Dinah's quiet, desperate act of defiance had achieved a form of immortality she could never have imagined. The story was now out of Eleanor's control, out of Savannah's control. It belonged to the world. It was a permanent testament, a quiet, powerful victory that was still winning day after day in the heart of Savannah and beyond. The turn of the 20th century arrived in Savannah not with a roar, but with the quiet, inexorable turning of a page. Eleanor Vance was dead, her passing as unremarked upon as the fall of a single withered leaf in her overgrown garden. The Vance mansion, a derelict ruin that had long been a subject of morbid local fascination, was finally put up for auction. It was bought for a pittance, a sum that would have been an insult to Robert Vance but meant nothing to the house's new owner. His name was Mr. Harrison, a pragmatic industrialist from the north, a man of iron, steam, and cold, hard figures. He saw the world through a lens of potential profit and practical application. And when he looked at the decaying mansion, he did not see the ghosts of a fallen aristocracy or the lingering stain of its history. He saw a prime piece of property, a structurally sound shell that could be gutted, modernized, and transformed into a grand summer home, a testament to his own success in a new and vigorous century. He had, of course, heard the stories. The legend of the Shadow Woman had been a staple of Southern folklore for decades, thanks in no small part to Alistair Finch's article. Harrison dismissed it all as superstitious nonsense, the fanciful ramblings of a defeated and sentimental people. He had no patience for ghost stories, no time for the intangible. He walked the dusty, silent rooms of his new acquisition with his foreman, a local man named George, whose grandfather had told him stories of the Vance shadow when he was just a boy. "We'll have this place cleared out and rebuilt in 6 months," Harrison declared, his voice booming with a confidence that seemed alien in the quiet, decaying space. He pointed with a decisive finger toward the locked parlor door. "Start with that room. I want it gutted. And I want that wall," he said, his voice laced with a dismissive amusement. "Gone by Tuesday." George swallowed hard. He was a practical man himself, a man who worked with wood and stone, but he was also a man of Savannah. The story of Dinah was woven into the fabric of the city, as much a part of it as the cobblestones and the Spanish moss. To him, that wall was not just plaster and lath. It was a landmark, a tombstone, a thing to be respected. "Mr. Harrison, sir," he began hesitantly, "the folks around here, they have a feeling about that wall." Harrison clapped him on the shoulder, a gesture that was meant to be friendly but felt more like a physical dismissal of his concerns. "Feelings don't build houses, George. Sledgehammers do. It's a new century. We're not afraid of shadows anymore." The demolition crew arrived the next morning. They were all local men who had grown up with the legend, and their mood was somber. As they filed into the dusty parlor, the air grew thick and heavy, as if the house itself were holding its breath. The men moved with a reluctant slowness, their usual boisterous energy replaced by a tense, watchful silence. Some of them made subtle signs with their hands, a quick cross over the chest or a gesture to ward off evil, learned from their mothers and grandmothers. In the center of the main wall, the silhouette of Dinah waited for them. It seemed to drink the morning light, a patch of absolute darkness in the dusty room. It was silent, patient, and profoundly present. George, the foreman, felt the weight of his crew's fear and his own deep, ingrained unease. He could feel Harrison's impatient eyes on him from the doorway, a silent command to get on with it, to prove that his modern, rational world was stronger than their old, superstitious one. With a deep breath that did little to calm the frantic beating of his heart, George hefted the first sledgehammer. He stood before the wall, before the image of the woman who had conquered this house with her will alone. He muttered a quiet, almost inaudible apology to the silent shape, and then he swung. The impact was a deafening crack that shattered the room's stillness. A spiderweb of fractures erupted from the point of impact, and a cloud of plaster dust, gray and choking, exploded into the air. The men flinched as if the wall itself had cried out in pain. But the first blow was struck. The spell was broken. They worked all day, their initial fear giving way to the grim rhythm of destruction. They tore at the wall with hammers and crowbars, shattering the plaster that held the image, ripping away the thin strips of wooden lath, pulling out the clumps of horsehair insulation that had been packed there more than half a century before. They worked until nothing remained but the dark, soot-stained brick of the chimney breast. The wall and the shadow it had carried for so long were gone, reduced to a pile of rubble and dust that was swept up, shoveled into wheelbarrows, and unceremoniously dumped in a wagon outside. Harrison stood in the room that evening, a smug smile playing on his lips. The parlor was now open and chaotic, a gaping wound in the side of the house, but to him it was a sign of progress. He kicked at a stray piece of broken plaster on the floor. "See, George," he said, his voice echoing in the newly opened space. "Nothing but plaster and dust, superstition and rot. Get to rebuilding." A week later, the parlor was beginning to look like a room again. The gaping hole had been framed with fresh pale lumber, and the new wall had been covered in lath and given its first coats of wet white plaster. It was a blank slate, a symbol of Harrison's triumph over the past. George was inspecting the work as it dried, running his hand over the smooth, cool surface. The air smelled clean of fresh wood and wet lime. The house felt lighter, exercised. He was beginning to think that Harrison had been right after all. It was just a story. As he stood there, watching the plaster slowly cure in the afternoon light, he noticed something. A faint discoloration in the very center of the new wall. It was a small, nebulous patch of gray, no bigger than his hand, like a storm cloud forming on a clear summer day. He squinted, thinking it was a trick of the light, or perhaps an impurity in the plaster mix. He called one of his men over. "You see that?" he asked, pointing. The man stared, his eyes widening. "Yeah, boss, I see it." They watched, and soon the entire crew gathered, their tools forgotten. They stood in a stunned, silent cluster as over the course of the long, hot afternoon the gray patch darkened and coalesced. It grew with a slow, deliberate, and terrifying certainty, its edges sharpening, its form becoming horribly, impossibly familiar. It was not a stain. It was a becoming. By the time the sun began to set, casting long, distorted shadows across the room, the silhouette of Dinah Miles had returned. It was perfectly rendered on a wall that had not existed a week ago, a wall made of new wood, new nails, and new plaster. And it was clearer, darker, and more sharply defined than any of them had ever seen it before, as if the act of its destruction had only served to focus its energy, to burn its image even more deeply into the very fabric of the space. George found Harrison in his temporary office, a small room at the back of the house where he was poring over blueprints. The foreman's face was the color of wet ash, and his hands were trembling. "You have to see it, sir," he said, his voice a choked whisper. "It's back." Harrison looked up, annoyed at the interruption and at the man's obvious terror. "What's back, George? Pull yourself together." "The shadow," George said, his voice trembling. "It's on the new wall." With an exasperated sigh, Harrison threw down his pen and stormed toward the parlor, ready to berate his foreman for succumbing to local hysterics. He strode into the room, his mouth already open to speak, and then he stopped dead. The words died in his throat. He stared at the silhouette, his mind, a thing of logic and mechanics, refusing to accept what his eyes were seeing. It was impossible. He walked toward it as if in a trance, his hand outstretched. He touched the plaster. It was cold, unnaturally so. A deep, penetrating cold that seemed to sap the warmth from his fingertips. It was the cold of the grave. The next morning, the entire crew of local workers quit. George delivered the news to a pale and sleepless Harrison. "We're not fighting a ghost, Mr. Harrison," the foreman said, his voice firm with a resolve born of pure terror. "We'll not raise another hand against her." Harrison, shaken but still stubborn, tried to hire men from out of state, offering double the wages. But the story of the shadow's return spread faster than a wildfire, carried by telegraph and telephone in the mouths of the terrified workers. It was no longer a quaint piece of folklore. It was an active, inexplicable, and terrifying event. No one would work on the haunted wall. No crew would set foot in the cursed house. Defeated, unnerved, and for the first time in his life, confronted with a force that his money could not command and his logic could not explain, Harrison abandoned the project. He ordered the windows and doors to be boarded up, sealing the house and its impossible inhabitant away from the world. He left Savannah that week and never returned. The moment was one of pure, terrifying awe for all who heard the tale. Dinah's spirit was not tied to the paint or the plaster or the wall. It was tied to the space, to the very spot on the earth where she had poured out her soul. Her will had proven stronger than brick and mortar, stronger than a new century's arrogant march of progress. She had won. Again. The present day finds the Vance mansion a skeleton picked clean by time and weather. It is no longer a place of horror, but one of strange, poetic beauty. Ivy, thick as a man's arm, snakes up the peeling columns, and the roof of the grand parlor has long since collapsed, leaving it open to the vast, indifferent sky. It has become a picturesque ruin, a favorite spot for ghost tours that trade in cheap thrills, and for serious historians who seek a deeper truth. Nature has reclaimed much of it, the scent of wild jasmine and damp earth now overpowering the lingering ghosts of expensive perfumes and beeswax polish. Yet the parlor, while roofless and exposed, remains strangely intact, its four walls standing defiant against the slow siege of decay. It is here that Dr. Aris Thorne and Lena Washington stand, their presence a quiet intrusion into the house's long slumber. Aris is a historian, a man whose life is dedicated to sifting through the dust of the past to find the narratives that have been deliberately buried. He sees history not as a collection of dates and names, but as a tapestry of stories, and he is here to document the most enduring story of them all. Lena is something else entirely. A paranormal investigator by trade, she approaches the unseen with a scientist's rigor and a poet's sensitivity. But her connection to this place is deeper than professional curiosity. She is a distant descendant of old Jacob's sister, a fact that makes this investigation a pilgrimage, a journey back to the roots of her own family's story of survival and resilience. They stand before the wall. The silhouette is still there. A century of blistering sun and driving rain has faded it, softening its edges, but it is unmistakably, undeniably present. It is a pale gray now, the color of a faded photograph, yet it holds its ground against the crumbling plaster, a permanent memory etched into the heart of the ruin. Aris gestures to it, his voice filled with a quiet reverence that transcends academic interest. Historically, every account confirms it, he says, his words for Lena but also for the microphone of the small digital recorder he holds. After Harrison fled, no one ever tried to remove it again. It was as if his failure was so absolute, so terrifying, that it served as a permanent warning. They learned to live with it. The town grew up around it. The story became more real, more solid than the house itself. Lena says nothing for a long moment, her focus entirely on the wall. She slowly unpacks her equipment, her movements deliberate and respectful. She is not here to hunt a ghost, she is here to listen to an ancestor. She powers on a thermal camera first, its lens translating the world into a shifting map of heat. She pans it across the crumbling brick and plaster, a landscape of ambient yellows and oranges, until she centers it on the silhouette. The shape of the woman on her screen is a deep, cold blue, a void of temperature several degrees colder than the surrounding wall. The energy differential is significant, she murmurs, her voice low. It's a constant drain, a thermal sink. Next, she takes out an EMF meter. Elsewhere in the ruin, the needle on the device remains placid, barely twitching. But as she brings it closer to the wall, closer to the shadow, the needle begins to dance. It jumps and spikes erratically, the device emitting a frantic staccato crackle. It is not a steady field, but a chaotic pulsing energy, as if it is responding to her presence. Finally, she sets up a highly sensitive digital recorder on a small tripod. Its microphone aimed directly at the heart of the silhouette. She adjusts the levels, filtering out the low rumble of distant traffic and the high-frequency whisper of the wind. "There's an immense amount of energy concentrated right here," she says, her eyes never leaving the pale gray shape. Her voice is a whisper, as if she is afraid of disturbing a delicate balance. "But it's not what I expected. It's not hostile. It's not angry or vengeful." She pauses, trying to find the right word. "It's watchful, patient, like it's been waiting." They stay as the afternoon bleeds into evening. The sun dips below the horizon and the sky turns a bruised purple and orange. The long shadows of the ruined walls stretch across the parlor floor, mingling with the one shadow that is permanent, the one that does not need the sun to exist. The air grows cooler, and the sounds of the city fade, replaced by the gentle rhythmic chirping of crickets, a sound that has filled this space for centuries. In the deepening twilight, Lena walks over to the recorder and presses the playback button. They listen. At first, there is only the gentle hiss of static and the clear, crisp song of the crickets they are hearing in the air around them. Eris feels a familiar faint pang of disappointment. The historical record, the physical evidence, that was the truth. The rest was just story, just legend. Lena closes her eyes, her face a mask of intense concentration, listening not just with her ears, but with her entire being. She is listening for a whisper beneath the noise. The recording plays on minute after silent minute, and then it happens. Amidst the static so faint that it is almost a hallucination, a sound emerges. It is not the wind. It is not an animal. It is a voice. A woman's voice, a whisper that seems to carry the weight of 100 years of silence. It is faint, dry, like the rustle of dead leaves, but it is also clear, resonant, and utterly undeniable. It speaks one word, a word that is not a plea but a command, a purpose, a legacy. Remember. The word hangs in the air between them, more real than the crumbling walls, more solid than the ground beneath their feet. It is the ultimate confirmation, the final missing piece of the puzzle. Eris and Lena look at each other, their faces illuminated by the pale glow of the recorder's screen, and in their shared gaze is a profound and shattering understanding. Then they both turn to look at the silhouette, which seems to darken in the twilight, to become more present, more complete. Dinah's goal was never to haunt, to frighten, to be a vengeful specter in the house of her suffering. Her purpose was infinitely greater. It was to ensure that she, and the millions like her whose names were lost, whose stories were erased, whose very existence was denied, would not be forgotten. The moon, a perfect silver disk, rises in the sky, its light pouring down into the roofless parlor, bathing the scene in a soft, ethereal glow. The final shot is of the silhouette on the wall, a quiet, enduring presence under the vast, star-dusted canvas of the night. The story concludes here, but it does not end. It reflects on the true nature of legacy. The Vances and the Harrisons, men of power and property, men who believed they could build, own, and erase at will, left behind nothing but crumbling bricks, forgotten names in dusty ledgers, and a cautionary tale of arrogance. Their power was ephemeral, their fortunes transient, their legacies swallowed by the very history they sought to command. Their attempts to impose their will on the world were ultimately futile. Their grand houses and grander ambitions reduced to dust. Dinah Miles, a woman who owned nothing, not even her own body, a woman who was considered less than human, a footnote in her master's account book. created a monument that has outlasted them all. By refusing to be erased, by pouring her very soul into a wall, she became the author of an immortal story. A story that has been passed down through generations. A story that has more power and permanence than any stone fortress or financial empire. Her shadow, the thing she left behind, is not an absence of light, but the enduring, undeniable presence of a soul that refused to be extinguished. It is a permanent testament to the power of the human spirit to resist, to endure, and to create a legacy not of property but of memory. It is a quiet, powerful victory that is still winning. Day after day in the heart of Savannah,